Johnny Carson's Tonight Show desk was a proving ground where comedy careers were made or destroyed in 7 brutal minutes. For 3 decades, that desk saw thousands of performers walk out under those bright lights, most of them good enough to hold their own, entertaining enough to justify their time slot. But scattered throughout those years were moments of such spectacular failure that they became legend. Moments where even Carson himself, the master of salvaging disaster, couldn't rescue what was happening. These weren't just ordinary bad nights. These were train wrecks you couldn't look away from. Performers so deeply out of sync with the format that every second felt like watching someone drown in slow motion. The thing about bombing on The Tonight Show wasn't just that you weren't funny. It was that your failure happened in front of millions of people, preserved on tape forever, becoming the thing people remembered about you instead of all the times you succeeded. Lee Marvin walked onto that stage when Don Rickles was guest hosting, and it should have been magic. Rickles could make a lamppost funny if he wanted to. But Marvin came out completely shut down from the first moment he sat down. When Rickles asked about his Hawaii plans, Marvin gave clipped, dead-end responses. He wasn't playing along, wasn't giving Rickles anything to bounce off. Rickles kept tossing setups, trying to provoke some kind of reaction, but Marvin maintained this cool, detached demeanor that created these long, painful silences where you could feel the audience getting uncomfortable. When Rickles asked about his new film, Marvin corrected him flatly that he'd done it a year ago, killing whatever momentum the conversation had. His ego wouldn't let him be vulnerable or playful. The audience didn't find it charming. They found it awkward. Being cool and aloof might make you a movie star, but it makes you a terrible talk show guest. Peter O'Toole's first appearance became instantly infamous, the kind of disaster that people talked about for years. He showed up drunk, not the fun kind of drunk where you're loose and charming, but the sloppy kind where coherence becomes optional. He'd start sentences that went nowhere, laughing at things only he understood, clearly convinced he was absolutely killing while everyone else sat there in stunned silence. The segment dragged on and on because there was nothing to work with, no way to redirect the energy into something salvageable. There's something uniquely uncomfortable about watching someone bomb while they're completely convinced they're succeeding. It became part of Tonight Show folklore, not because it was entertainingly bad, but because it was so spectacularly awkward that it felt historic. Rich Hall walked into a setup that should have worked for him. His material was dry and sarcastic, technically funny if you were on his wavelength. But the Tonight Show audience that night wasn't on his wavelength at all. His delivery was low-key, almost deadpan, making jokes about salad bars and the Olympics that required the crowd to meet him halfway. They didn't. You could watch him delivering lines that probably killed in smaller clubs, but here they landed with this hollow thud. Once a comedian feels the room slipping away, every subsequent joke carries more pressure than the last. Hall kept going, probably hoping momentum would shift, but it never did. It's a brutal reminder that being funny isn't enough. You have to be funny in the right way for that specific room at that specific moment. Charles Grodin turned being irritating into an art form on The Tonight Show. He'd come out seemingly annoyed by the whole premise of being there, pressing Carson with aggressively earnest questions that felt more like confrontation than banter. He'd taunt Johnny, question his sincerity, ask if he really cared about anything beyond television. At first, Carson would play along, assuming this was an elaborate bit. But as Grodin kept pushing, you could see Johnny's patience visibly evaporate. The audience didn't know how to react. Scattered, confused laughs punctuated long silences where people seemed genuinely unsure if this was supposed to be funny. Viewers wrote angry letters to NBC calling Grodin disrespectful. The problem with committing so completely to an anti-comedy bit is that eventually it stops being subversive and just becomes annoying. Chevy Chase had a fundamental problem that Carson once articulated with brutal clarity. Johnny said Chase couldn't ad-lib a fart after a baked bean dinner, which is devastating public criticism from someone who usually kept his real opinions private. What Carson was saying was that Chase needed everything scripted in advance, that he couldn't do spontaneous conversational improvisation the way natural talk show guests could. And if you watch Chase's Carson appearances knowing what to look for, You can absolutely see this limitation. When things went off script even slightly, Chase would get visibly uncomfortable. The charm and confidence would drain from his face. He'd reach for sarcasm that came off as genuinely mean instead of playful. The talk show couch rewards warmth and quick conversational skills above everything else. When his energy turned prickly or defensive, audiences stopped laughing immediately because it felt genuinely tense instead of playfully antagonistic. Bob Hope gets called unfunny on Johnny Carson constantly, which seems absurd given his legendary status, but the criticism makes perfect sense when you understand the specifics. Hope would arrive at the studio with jokes pre-written on index cards, refusing to engage in actual spontaneous conversation. He'd sit there waiting for his turn to deliver the next written line instead of genuinely reacting to what Johnny was saying. This created incredibly weird energy, where jokes were technically happening, but nothing felt alive or fun. The audience would give polite laughter, because Bob Hope is an icon, and you're supposed to laugh at Bob Hope, but it wasn't real enjoyment. It was respectful obligation. Carson built his show on spontaneity and authentic conversation. Hope came in doing old-school vaudeville timing that didn't fit the format at all. Rich Little's entire act was rapid-fire celebrity impressions, and that's precisely why so many people found it tedious. It felt like sitting through an endless string of different voices without any actual jokes underneath. The main point was just listen how accurate this sounds, which only works if the audience instantly recognizes who's being mimicked and cares about that person. If they don't immediately know the celebrity being imitated, the room goes completely quiet because there's literally nothing else to laugh at. Little's long Tonight Show run eventually ended badly after he did a Carson impression on the show that Johnny apparently believed crossed a line. The bigger issue was that Little's act had a very limited shelf life. Once you've heard all the voices, there's no compelling reason to watch again. Impressions without actual comedy writing are just party tricks, and party tricks get old extremely fast. Charlie Callis had this extremely high-volume, frantic sound effect-driven comedy style that either absolutely crushed or completely wore people out, depending on the room. There's a famous story everyone repeats about one night when his routine wasn't landing and Carson did his signature bomb sound effect after a joke died. Supposedly, Callis physically shoved Carson in response and got permanently banned from the show forever. That story became absolute legend, but it's heavily disputed. What we know for sure is that people who watched remember that particular appearance as deeply awkward. Callis visibly got more frantic and louder as laughs didn't come. Whether there was an actual physical shove or not, the evening became infamous as a prime example of a comedian spiraling when the audience absolutely wasn't with him. Watching someone work harder and harder, get louder and more frantic for laughs that simply aren't coming is genuinely painful for everyone. Johnny Carson himself had nights where nothing worked, and those moments are remembered specifically because he didn't panic. He often made the failure itself the joke. There are surviving monologues where punchlines get little to no reaction, and Johnny openly acknowledges it, riffing on the silence instead of pretending it didn't happen. Even Carson sometimes hit stretches where joke after joke didn't lift. The difference is he knew how to acknowledge it and move on. Most guests couldn't do that. They'd panic or get defensive. Carson would just shrug and make the bomb part of the show. That self-awareness, that ability to step outside the moment and comment on it, that's what separated him from everyone else who bombed on his stage. Fred Rogers wasn't a joke guy at all, so some viewers misread his Tonight Show appearances as unfunny because he didn't perform in the normal late-night rhythm everyone expected. On his appearance, the audience laughed at the contrast between Johnny's energy and Rogers' calm, sincere responses, but Rogers didn't play for laughs back. He answered gently and earnestly, which can feel like jokes are bouncing off him even though that's exactly the point of who he is. His whole vibe is intentionally disarming and wholesome. He speaks slowly and thoughtfully like he's talking to one person instead of a studio full of people waiting for punchlines. That alone breaks the late-night contract most viewers are used to. Carson tosses setups the way he always does, and Rogers responds like a human being instead of a comedian, not deflecting, not escalating, not trying to win the moment, just answering honestly and staying present. For some people, that reads as awkward or flat because the usual rhythm never kicks in. There's no back-and-forth volley of jokes, no competitive banter, no payoff laugh that releases the tension. The silence hangs longer than people are comfortable with on a comedy show. You can feel the audience unsure of what their role even is. Should they laugh or listen? Rogers doesn't guide them toward laughter because he isn't there to entertain in that way. He's there to connect, and that difference matters. Late-night audiences are trained to respond fast and loudly. Rogers asks them to slow down without ever saying it out loud. What makes it more uncomfortable for some viewers is that Carson clearly respects him. Johnny leans in instead of pushing harder. He softens his own energy to match Rogers instead of trying to steamroll him with jokes. That's rare on The Tonight Show. Carson usually controls the rhythm of the room completely. With Rogers, he lets the moment breathe. That choice quietly tells the audience, this isn't a bit that's failing, it's a different kind of exchange altogether. But not everyone catches that in real time. Rogers' sincerity also removes irony from the equation. Late-night comedy often relies on layers of irony and self-awareness. Rogers doesn't operate there at all. He says exactly what he means and means exactly what he says. That kind of emotional directness can make people squirm because there's nothing to hide behind. No joke armor, no sarcasm, no wink to let you off the hook. He's comfortable being gentle on a show built for sharpness. So when people say Rogers was unfunny on Carson, what they're really reacting to is discomfort, not failure. He wasn't bombing. He was refusing to perform the role they expected him to play. He wasn't there to be clever or edgy or fast. He was there to be kind and steady and sincere, in a space that rarely allowed that tone to exist for more than a few seconds. That mismatch is exactly why some viewers labeled it awkward, while others remember it as strangely memorable. It wasn't comedy dying. It was comedy stepping aside for something more important. These moments, all of them, reveal something fundamental about performance and expectation, and the weird alchemy that makes late-night television work when it works and collapse spectacularly when it doesn't.